Hey guys, what is up? So we just got the reveal for Aphelios as well as his champion spell Gifts from the Beyond, and I have been theory crafting all evening right now. It is currently 1 a.m. in the morning, and I've built 3 Aphelios decks that I think will be potentially up to speed for the new expansion, using a lot of different kind of like takes on how to build Aphelios. So a couple of things before we start looking at the decks and talking about why I built them in the way I did. Aphelios is not going to be out for a while. It's going to be at least a month before Aphelios comes out because he's going to be out in February according to the timeline that the devs put. Additionally, you'll notice that these are all purely theory craft decks. There might be some more cards coming with Aphelios. It's kind of implied a little bit, depending on like how you read it. A lot of people are saying that it's likely that there will be some more support cards dropping with Aphelios that they haven't shown yet. So it's also very possible that these theory crafted builds are going to have to be modified pretty aggressively at that point in time when we actually see more of the support cards. So just keep that in mind. These aren't really net decks. These aren't going to be decks that I would recommend. When Aphelios actually comes out, I'll make a video on net decks, but this is just a fun theory craft thing that is going to be really interesting to do. And of course, even though I will need to tweak these decks, it gives us a good starting point for how we need to be thinking about building efficient Aphelios decks that can compete at a high level. I do want to say overall, and if you watched my initial impressions for Aphelios, I was a little uncertain about how I felt about the power level of him and his support card. I've been thinking about it all day. I think Aphelios is a fairly powerful card. He's going to be pretty tricky to use, but I think he's actually one of the better champions in the game for sure, and he will hit probably multiple viable decks, although viable can be kind of like more in the experimental territory. I think his champ spell, Gifts from Beyond, is absolutely insane. I think this card is just pure nuts, bonkers. You'll be running this in like all Targon decks, regardless of whether or not they run Aphelios. So it's very cool. I love the design of these cards. They're super competitive, and they actually make you think a lot. Let's go ahead and break down what these cards actually do, and real quick, and then we'll actually get into the deck build. So Aphelios is a 3-mana 3/3 Targon card. He has Nightfall. Pick a moon weapon to create in hand. When you've played 2 other cards in a round, create a phased moon weapon in hand if you don't have one already. He has 5 different moon weapons. And they're all 2-cost slow spells. Calibrum, which deals 3 at slow speed to a follower. Ceravum gives an ally +1/+2 in lifesteal this round, a temporary buff. Again, this is a slow 2-mana spell like they all are. Gravitum, which is a stun, and also if it's a follower, then it re-stuns again as well next turn, which is a very interesting effect we've never seen in Runeterra yet. Infernum, which is +2/+1 and overwhelm this round, and Crescendum, which is a tutor. This is an incredibly powerful version of the card, which is it can pull a 2-cost follower from your deck, and if it has Nightfall, activate it. It's not really, I think a lot of people are kind of baited by this line here, as well as how Aphelios is as a card. A lot of people look at Aphelios like a Nightfall synergy card just because he himself has Nightfall and one of his cards says the word Nightfall in it, but I definitely wouldn't recommend building him in that way. More on that later. Gifts from Beyond is simply a 2-cost per spell that chooses one of these 5 weapons to create in hand, which, you know, is very similar to Super Cool Star Chart or Behold the Infinite. It's just the 2-mana burst that gives you this option. Here's the thing. With both Aphelios and Gifts from Beyond, you see all 5 cards at once, right? When you play Aphelios Nightfall and you choose a moon weapon, it shows you all 5 and you get your choice of the 5, which is very powerful. Gifts from Beyond is the same way. This card is omega flexible, giving you a choice of 5, and there's almost always going to be something here that's absolutely worth paying a total of 4 mana for. The last cool thing about how Aphelios works is this line here. When you've played 2 other cards in a round, it creates the phased moon weapon in hand if you don't already have one. So you'll also notice some of these moon weapons all phase into 2 different forms each. So what that means is it's a sequence that's sort of optional. When you play, let's say I play Aphelios and I choose Calibrum, right? Because its next card is either Severum or Gravitum. What that means is when I play for the second moon weapon, when I play the 2 other cards in the round later and get the second phased moon weapon, it will give me a choice of Severum or Gravitum, and then I'll pick one of those, and then they'll just keep chaining their own phases, and it goes in a little link. If you want an infographic, there's actually been one whipped up by the community, which is really nice. This infographic here just shows like all the different chains. Every one of them phases into 2 different cards, and it creates like this interesting kind of loop here depending on how you choose to route it. And lastly, we've got Aphelios' level up, which isn't really very important. It's a little hard to do. You have to cast 4 moon weapons, and sometimes you get additional value out of this, which is, you know, you get to sometimes get extra moon weapons per turn. You get like 2 moon weapons per turn instead of 1, and your moon weapons cost 1 less, which is pretty valuable. Overall, I think the best way to think about Aphelios is that he's kind of like Zoe's big brother, right? They do a very similar thing. They're both in Targon. They both kind of play at the same speed. And it's kind of an annoying must-remove engine that is just generating free card value every turn that also offers flexibility, right? Like Zoe's drawing you into super cool Star Chart, and Aphelios is drawing you to his weapons, which you can choose what you want, right? And I think that his level up should be considered kind of the same way as Zoe's level up in that way, which is, you know, sometimes you'll level him up and sometimes that value will actually be relevant to you winning the game. But for the most part, he's like Zoe, where he just wants to be a first form card that will just generate a lot of value. And over time, if the opponent doesn't remove him, he can just sort of like flexibly decide the outcome of the game in the next several turns. So very, very similar to Zoe. And I think a lot of people that are underrating Aphelios are underrating him for the same reasons that most people were underrating Zoe. So now that we've covered kind of the most competitive way to look at Aphelios as a card and what his objectives is in a deck build, let's go ahead and actually get into the decks themselves so that, you know, we can talk about it, because I think the most important thing with a Theorycraft is being able to just look at the cards and kind of explain like why I've chosen these lists that I have. So deck number 1, and these are 3 decks that I built in coordination with Kuvira and Precipic. We've been thinking about a lot of different ways to kind of build out these concepts. This is a Zoe Aphelios deck, and right away you'll notice that you might see a little smudge of Tarek here. This, make no mistake, is Aphelios. Of course, in the deck builder from Oblitix, I know I don't have the ability to run Aphelios yet. And this is, of course, this is not Starspring. This is Gifts from Beyond, his new champion spell, right? So just, I'm gonna say that now. I don't want comments to be asking me why I'm running Tarek in this deck. It's not okay. We're good. Okay. Anyway. This build is pretty good. I actually expect something like this to be fairly competitive, although I'm going to, obviously, you know, it's going to need a bit of refinement, and we're going to have to see exactly how it plays into this meta. So this is actually built off of some similar concepts that I've been playing around with the idea of Zoe in Piltover and Zon. And, well, we have Aphelios that actually hits this deck pretty hard. It's really like I was saying, that Aphelios is basically, he's like Zoe's big brother, right? It really just is like, this is his function as a card. And he works really well with Zoe for that reason. They work very well as like early drops in a deck that wants to just generate a lot of value and make sure it's not really running out of resources, while playing very flexibly for the Aphelios and the Zoe. So in a deck like this, you'll notice a couple of distinct things about the build. First of all, we are running a semi-discard package. It's sort of built a little bit like, you know, a classic Ezreal Draven deck, like you might see here, for example. We're running stuff like Rummage. We're running ways of being able to discard cards like Spacey Sketcher and like Poro Cannon, but we're also running a lot of things that could be discard fodder, like I'll happily discard the Ignitions from Ballistic Bots, or in some cases the Dusk Petal Dust from Lorn Dustbringer in this deck. You'll also notice that we're not running Mountain Goat, and there's actually a specific reason for this, which is one of the recurring themes you'll see with Aphelios, which is this card, Crescendum, which is one of Aphelios' weapons, which summons a 2-cost follower from your deck. This is a very, very, very powerful effect, but it means if we want to get a specific powerful 2-cost follower that allows our deck to be built in a like high synergy way around it, it means we do have to cut some of the other cards. So I'll experiment a little bit with this, and there's a chance I'll add back in some amount of Mountain Goat. But the idea here is that with that card, we're pulling Ballistic Bot every time. This is very important for how this deck is built, because Ballistic Bot is going to help us curve into some of the options for, you know, discarding and cycling, as well as just put incidental chip damage of pressure out on the opponent. Now, Aphelios works really, really well with this kind of deck for another reason as well, which is that if you've played Ballistic Bot, you'll know that one thing Ballistic Bot really, really, really needs is a way for Ballistic Bot's damage, because in a deck that runs augment cards, in fact, we augment a lot of cards. This Poro Cannon, for example, is going to make Ballistic Bot grow to like 10 attack pretty easily, and what this deck needs is a way to make that damage deal Nexus damage, because otherwise we're getting jump blocked. So that means something like Overwhelm, something like Elusive, right? And Aphelios not only has the ability to pull ballistic bots from your deck, again, it's not just Aphelios that can do this, it's also the Gifts from Beyond that can pull a ballistic bot from my deck, but also he can give the ballistic bot Overwhelm with the Infernum weapon, which is very, very, very powerful. There's a lot of matchups where if the opponent doesn't have access to Hush, they will literally either just lose on the spot to your ballistic bot or have to like vengeance it or something horrible, which usually kind of results in them losing. Like if they're forced to vengeance a ballistic bot in like the early late game, for example, then we're just kind of winning off of that almost always. Like that's just such an amazing forced exchange for me. So a bit of extra synergy this deck has, you'll notice, is the Poro Cannon. Now, one of the downsides of Aphelios is that sometimes it's a little bit hard getting the Nightfall off on this character. You want to be able to play Aphelios on turn 3 in a lot of situations, and sometimes you can use, you can use his champ spell for that. Gifts from Beyond, you can like curve this into Aphelios on turn 3. That's all right. Sometimes you can use super cool star chart. Is okay, but a nice thing that this deck has the ability to do is just use Poro Cannon for the Nightfall trigger. You'll also notice Poro Cannon has an additional synergy with Aphelios, because Aphelios not only needs the Nightfall trigger, but if you want to be able to get additional moon weapons every turn, you need to play, a bunch of cards in a round, right? You want to play the cheap cards and just trigger like activation triggers so that you can get your weapon from Aphelios. And of course, Poro Cannon just gives us, like, for 0 mana, we can trigger once, and it allows us to trigger, 1 mana and 1 mana. So we just get a ton of activation triggers to not only enable the Nightfall on Aphelios, but also help the ability for him to actually draw his guns. In addition to that, something that this deck can do, which is actually really, really, really funny, is that if we use Spacey Sketcher and we pull up this card from Spacey Sketcher Moonsilver, which I just realized I'm not going to be able to show on screen without going into this awkward token thing. Moonsilver, the Spacey Sketcher card. If we play a Sketcher on 1 for Moonsilver, we can actually use Moonsilver into the Nightfall's Aphelios on turn 2, which I don't think you'll do a ton with the Aphelios decks, but there's a lot of matchups where it's actually just like ridiculously efficient to be able to do that. So I'm pretty happy to sometimes just play Sketcher on 1 for that reason. It'll be an interesting thing to try out at the very least. Now, I guess the last major component of this deck that I haven't really... Actually, no, we should talk about Duskbringer. Duskbringer is kind of replacing Mountain Goat in this deck in terms of having like a cheap unit that's able to give discard fodder. We can discard the Dusk Petal Dust like we would discard the Mountain Goat's gem, and that's just going to help us cycle with stuff like Sump Treasure, stuff like Rummage, stuff like Poro Cannon, and stuff like Spacey Sketcher. But unlike Mountain Goat, it means that we'll always get Ballistic Bot when we play Crescendum, and more importantly, it can sometimes help trigger the Nightfall effect from Aphelios. You guys might notice I'm pausing a little bit. Some of these card names I'm trying to like remember on the fly. So yeah, it's just an additional function of Duskbringer. But a way this deck will win a lot is just by having like ridiculous high attack ballistic bots and giving them Overwhelm, and you can actually give them multiple instances of Overwhelm, so even if the opponent hushes 1, they can just lose on the spot to it. And the last card here, that's kind of like really significant to this build, is Insightful Investigator. So this card might want to be a Trump Lump, by the way. Insightful, I know you might look at this card and you're like, man, that just makes sense in this list. And I mean, it's cute in a lot of ways, but it's really a side grade to Chump Lump for this deck. I wanted a 4-mana card that is able to give like some amount of discard fodder, and Insightful is a slower option. Now, the cool thing about Insightful in this deck, first of all, I'd like to say Insightful has kind of been a somewhat underrated card in the past. It's seen some experimental play in competitive versions of some combo decks in the past. It's very fringe. It's never been like a staple of a competitive deck, but it's been pretty close to the edge. And in this deck, because of course all of Aphelios's weapons are 2 mana, Insightful will draw a few additional cards here. And of course we've got, the Hush, the Cascade, the Ballistic Bot, and as well as the gun summoning weapon, something of the gifts. God, I almost got it. Gifts from Beyond. Yes, that one. That's also 2 mana. So we just have a lot of ways of being able to use Insightful Investigator. To be honest, a lot of the fleeting draws, we're just going to go ahead and like, we can use them as discard fodder. Sometimes we can like rummage after drawing a couple cards from Insightful. That's okay. Like we don't need to use the card itself, but just having the card provides additional options. And Insightful Investigator is a nice card that we don't lose much value when it gets removed, because immediately we can just respond with a 2-cost card and at least just draw a card for it. So Insightful is just a really cute card that I might have to optimize the deck a little bit more around, but I think actually makes a lot of sense in this deck pretty uniquely. So I want to clarify the way this deck plays. It's a slower deck. It's pretty mid-range ultimately. You want to deal a little bit of chip damage with stuff like your Poro Cannons and stuff like your Ignitions and maybe your Zoe, just attacking them. So you do small amounts of chip damage while just making sure that the opponent doesn't really have good options. You're countering everything they do with your super cool star charts and your weapons from Aphelios that are just going to be flexible counter tools to whatever they can have, while making sure we're not running out of steam with our cycle cards like Sump Treasure and Rummage. And the cherry on top is Star Shaping, that is going to be mostly ending games. Just getting like a big elusive or the big overwhelm from Star Shaping is mostly a finisher, but we do have the ability to use Aphelios on an overwhelm bot to try like a cheese finisher. That's how this deck is currently built to play, and it's actually a pretty good game plan. So as I mentioned, it's a Theorycraft deck, but I'm going to be messing around with something along these lines in terms of Aphelios decks when the expansion with Aphelios launches, and it looks very promising. Okay, so next up we have the second Aphelios deck. Now this one, you'll notice we're not running a ton of Aphelios. This isn't as built around Aphelios, but this is also probably the most competitive of the three. Lee Sin is a very, very powerful deck right now on ladder. I am still a bit hesitant to put it on tier 1 in the tier list, just because that, right now on ladder, Lee Sin has tier 1 win rates at like really high ranks where people are playing it properly. When people make small amounts of misplays, it's a very tricky deck to pilot super well. And when you make small amounts of misplays, the win rate goes down a bit. So I don't know if it's like tier 1 on all areas of ladder, but it's a very, very, very good deck right now. So enter some of these new cards that make it even better. And honestly, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I'm actually really worried about this deck. I think that Gifts from Beyond hits this deck in a just absolutely absurd, ridiculous way. And I'm scared about Lee Sin becoming like the tier 1 meta cancer again. So let's talk about this build a little bit. What we've done in this build is we have cut out the other 2 drops, right? So you'll notice we're only running Eye of the Dragon. Again, there's a similar theme here. We are making it so that this card, the Gifts from the Beyond? Yes. Yeah, basically. Gifts from Beyond. We're making it so Gifts from Beyond is pulling out Eye of the Dragon every time, which is actually kind of completely insane. Because keep in mind, Gifts from the Beyond is a spell that creates the weapon. This weapon, Crescendum, is another 2 mana card that just pulls the follower onto the board, right? So on turn 3, when we double pass with this deck and we're on turn 3, we can just play from hand, we can play the Gifts from the Beyond, and then we can play the Crescendum, and we can always choose it from that. What that means is we'll always pull the Eye of the Dragon, and the Eye of the Dragon also has a tune, which means we'll get 1 mana back. So basically, we're triggering 2 spells, which means we're getting a Dragon Link next turn, and we're getting good Lee Sin progress, and we're only paying 3 mana for it, right? So we've played 2 spells, we've played 3 mana, our Eye of the Dragon is on the board, we have full banked mana, we still have 3 mana left over this turn, we're getting a Dragon Link next turn, and we're representing the power cards. We're representing Pale Cascade, we're representing Nopify. And you'll notice that even if we've played the Zoe earlier, we're still representing these threats. We still have 2 mana left over. That's crazy. Like Zoe on turn 1 into this double spell pulling Eye on turn 3, and still having Pale Cascade, still having Nopify, will just mess up everything the opponent could possibly do. On turn 3, when they play a scary card like Misfortune or Draven, like they play Draven on turn 3, in one action, I play my Eye of the Dragon. In one action, for 2 spells, I play Eye of the Dragon. Because this one's burst. So they play Draven. I burst this out and then play Crescendum. So my Eye is now on the board. And suddenly, the Draven can't attack because I have mana for Pale Cascade, plus the Eye of the Dragon on the board, and I'm getting the Dragonling next round no matter what. That is absolutely ridiculous. Like, the ability to pull out Eye of the Dragon with the Dragonling next round and having the extra mana banked is absurd for how Lee Sin decks want to play. Another really important thing about this list is that because we have the ability to pull Eye of the Dragon more reliably from our deck, we have a lot of ways of getting Eye of the Dragon to the board. What that means is we can build the deck in a way that's able to kind of capitalize on that higher reliability overall. This is the value of tutors. They allow you to build your deck. Tutor is just something that pulls something to the board or to your hand. It allows you to build the rest of your deck in a way where you're much more sure that you're going to have the Eye of the Dragon. Because when you run the numbers on it, the difference between like the natural Eye versus the Eye in this deck goes up a margin. I mean, it goes up to what we can practically call 100%. So if we're mulliganing very aggressively, I think in reality, this would be closer to 11. We'd have like a 63% chance of pulling Eye, right? But now, because we have the weapon that pulls it guaranteed, plus we even have the, in this case, one copy of Aphelios that can also pull Eye if we really want to, then this 63% chance goes up to a 91% chance of having Eye of the Dragon in a reasonable turn. Let's say turn 4, this is estimating for. And what that means is suddenly we can build the rest of the deck in a way that is more so anticipating we're going to have Eye. For example, Sonic Wave as a card gets a lot better. Sonic Wave is a card that's it's sometimes been a little clunky in this deck because it won't always find value, but if we can ensure that we're getting Eye of the Dragon in most games, suddenly Sonic Wave is much better. This card is kind of meant to be paired with Eye of the Dragon, right? We have the ability to make the Dragonling challenger, give something more attack, and it's a double spell, which, you know, is good for summoning a Dragonling next turn as well. Also, being able to run more Sonic Waves makes the deck kind of a little bit less dependent on the gems, which means, you know, for the Lee Sin win condition, we end up not minding so much that we're cutting the Mountain Goats out. So basically, this is the version of Lee Sin that I'm kind of like most anticipating to try to play with. There's a lot of cool things we can do with this deck, and I'm still working on the ratioing. There's a decent chance that Aphelios could be a 2 of and Zoe could be a 1 of. There is a consideration that it's 3 Zoe, no Aphelios. Aphelios is a cute splash in this deck because double drawing Zoe isn't really great, but depending on the meta, there's a chance Aphelios doesn't make the deck. Unfortunately, I mean, for the most part, this is just a power deck that uses the Gifts from Beyond. I have no idea why I can't remember this card's name. It's kind of generic. It's a power card in this deck, and this is a super scary archetype moving forward into the next patch. There's a couple of cards in this deck that are a little bit experimental. For example, I'm running Steel Tempest over Concussive Palm because I really, in this kind of build of the deck, I'm going to be more so favoring the cheaper curve. And Steel Tempest has had a big place in lead decks. It's a bit of a meta call whether we're running Steel Tempest or Palm, actually. One hilarious downside is Steel Tempest is nopifiable, whereas Palm is actually, the fact that it costs more mana can actually make it sometimes better in the mirror. And main decking super cool Star Chart. This is mostly seen as a card you get off of Zoe, but it's perfectly fine to main deck in something like this. And the ratios just kind of help us play flexibly for what our game plan is. The one thing that I think is very fine though is we're cutting Zenith Blade down to a 2 of. Zenith Blade definitely didn't need to be a 3 of in this deck, but it's just kind of like part of how Lee Sin needs to win. And again, keep in mind, one of the guns, one of the weapons is Infernum, the thing that gives Overwhelm. Now, this card has a distinct downside in Lee Sin compared to Zenith Blade because it's only for this round. Now, why is this a downside? Well, this means that if you don't have Zenith Blade, your Lee Sin can't open attack into the lethal turn, which enables a lot of opponent counterplay options like, for example, Arachnoid Sentry. Because if we're not using Zenith Blade, we can set up the turn before and then open attack with Lee while simultaneously casting like a burst spell to Challenger and win. But the one downside of Infernum over Zenith Blade is we don't have the ability to actually, you know, to open attack with this. But that's okay. It's not that big of a deal in a lot of matchups. And by running 2 Zenith Blade, we're still getting really good odds for that. I know it seems really weird running 2 Zenith Blade in this deck because when you look at it, it's a card that probably seems like you want 3 or 0 because the more Zenith Blades you have, the more you draw. But the reality of the situation is double drawing Zenith Blade isn't good, and it takes a very rare game for you to want all 3 Zenith Blades. You don't actually want to chain that many together. So 2 Zenith Blade, especially now that we have the alternate option for the overwhelm in the form of the weapons is perfectly fine, and I think will actually make this deck quite a bit better. Like I said, I'm scared of this one. I look at this and I'm terrified of what this card in that deck will potentially do to the meta. I mean, obviously, you know, we wait and see, but man, this is just so ridiculous in that deck. The thing is, like, even when you're not using it to tutor Eye of the Dragon, it's also just a super flexible tool. You can just use it as a stun. It will cast a spell trigger twice no matter what, which helps Lee kind of turbo level. It's also a double spell cast for the Eye of the Dragon that you already have on the board. Like, this card is just so ridiculous. The sheer flexibility you get when you play this card is always worth the 4 mana for 2 spell triggers in this deck, right? Like, depending on what the opponent has, you can give something lifesteal, you can stun their card, you can deal 3 damage to a follower. I think this one's a little bit more limited because dealing 3 damage to a champion would be a lot better. But there's definitely a lot of cases where you will use this card for value, right? Sometimes like Ballistic Bot sort of board states, for example. I also can't stress enough how big of a deal the lifesteal is. It's not something I've talked about in this video, but there will be a lot of matchups where when you use Severum to give something lifesteal, that will just kind of win the game against a lot of aggressive strategies. Like, giving something lifesteal in one action is kind of insane against a lot of decks that need to try to like rush you down. You can give it to a unit. I mean, again, even with like the Ballistic Bot deck, we can sometimes give this lifesteal instead of overwhelm, right? Against some decks, and just lifesteal up to full against like Ezreal Draven, and we just win off of that. And yeah, it's completely crazy. All right, and the third and final deck for this video is going to be an Invoke Targon deck running Aphelios. As I mentioned, I mean, really, again, I'm kind of like, yeah, I've said it twice in this video already, but Aphelios is really just wants to be paired with Zoe, right? They're doing a very, very similar kind of game plan, and when we combine Aphelios and Zoe, we can just kind of like build a deck around having the flexibility, having the stall, and just making sure we have a counter towards every option the opponent has. Now, this deck, you know, the Invoke deck that's running Atrocity, has had a pretty high win rate in certain versions at the top of Masters. It's a very difficult deck to play. This is not a deck that I don't think it's going to be as competitive as Lee Sin moving forward. But if you play this deck well, it will have scary results. You can definitely, if you are a very good player, you can absolutely climb to Masters with this deck. I mean, it will have a tier 1 win rate if you play it very well. But the reason it's so hard to play as a deck is because it's so insanely flexible, right? Not only are we invoking really any card we want, we can always choose a card we want. We have to be planning ahead on turns. But also, now that we have Aphelios, the skill ceiling of using this new champion is kind of absurdly high. Like, you have to pick your card thinking about the future, and then you also have to not just because you can't always play the weapon right away, but because you also have to plan your weapon choice based on what it phases into. Even you have to like think 2 weapons ahead. It's really cool design. I love Aphelios, but when you look at a deck like this, it's going to have a very intimidating skill ceiling to a lot of people. Like, there is so many different decision points to this deck. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So, I mean, in terms of what's happening in this deck, there's nothing really super fancy going on here. I mean, it's pretty much a par for the course Invoke deck that's just running value cards. It's like the epitome of a mid-range deck. We are just playing for flexible value and playing a very different strategy depending on what the opponent is doing, right? A lot of the same principles we've talked about in the other builds will absolutely apply to this one as well. You know, we do have, in this case, the gifts, and pulling out Mountain Goat is fine. Because there's nothing really high value in this deck to pull out with the Crescendum, we're probably not going to be pulling Crescendum a lot with gifts, unlike the other 2 decks that will be playing for Crescendum kind of a bit more. You can think of Crescendum like, it's sort of like TF's blue card, right? Which is that out of all the 5 options, Crescendum is a decent thing to pull when there's just like a board neutral state, when there's nothing happening and you just want to play for a value. Crescendum is kind of a nice thing to pull. In this deck in particular, you're probably going to not want Crescendum as much just because there's nothing at 2 mana we can really run in Targon that would even be worth, you know, going out of our way to pull. But there's plenty of board states where, I mean, I'll happily just Crescendum into the Mountain Goat. That's not even bad. It's a very flexible deck. I mean, I could break down how the Invoke deck works as a whole, but I mean, it's Invoke. Nothing new happening in this arc because we just invoke all the new cards and play super flexibly. Sometimes we can use the Duskbringer Petals to, trigger the Aphelios like we do in the other deck. Sometimes we can just use them as a discard target like with Spacey Sketcher. And yeah, it's a really just nice flexible approach. This deck is really great at teaching fundamentals if you just kind of want to learn how to play for value and how to kind of adapt to different game states. This deck will teach those extremely well. And yeah, that's it. That is 3 new Aphelios decks for the expansion. So as I said before, we don't know what things are going to look like. There's going to be balance patches. This is pure Theorycraft. Do not net deck these. These are not net deck ready. I will make a video when the patch actually happens with Aphelios. This was just a fun Theorycraft to talk about some of the different angles of Aphelios and how he really incentivizes deck building. I think a lot of people are probably looking at the card wrong, and it's actually causing them to misevaluate Aphelios' power level. He's definitely a lot better than some people think, although I don't think he's hyper nuts either. He's a pretty good champion. The reason he's good is just this raw flexibility combined with Targon's playstyle. He looks kind of like Riven, but the fact that these weapons are very reactive and actually affect things on the board instead of just being like side grades to gems, like Riven's weapons are just kind of gems. And also the fact that he's in Targon just makes it a completely different comparison. The biggest problem with Riven is that she's in Noxus, and when she's competing for Draven, there's just kind of no reason for Noxus to run that kind of effect beyond Draven, right? We don't really need another 3-drop, and Riven doesn't do a lot. Aphelios, completely different story. Really much more comparable to Zoe. And I mean, if we're underestimating Aphelios, then we're at a bit of a risk, because this card could definitely surprise us all. But as I mentioned at kind of the start of the video, I think Aphelios is not actually as powerful as his champ spell, Gifts from Beyond. Again, this card is ridiculous. This card might be auto-include in Targon decks, basically. The fact that it's always a choose 5 for whatever you want is insane flexibility, and there's decks like Lee Sin versions that would be able to run it that this deck might not end up running Aphelios. There will just be more decks that have the ability to use gifts than Aphelios. Another good example is my Fura Butterfly deck, which is absolutely a deck that will use gifts from the Beyond. We can pull out Sparklefly now. That's insane. This deck suddenly has something that can tutor Sparklefly, and on boards where I don't need the tutor, I can use gifts as something else. Like, all of these effects are really flexible and just really, 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 really mess with the opponent's game plan depending on, exactly what I want to do at the time. So yeah, it's just a super crazy card. It's probably going to hit a lot of Targon decks. Man, this Targon color is getting a lot of good cards, huh? Anyway, that's it. That's the 3 new decks that we can play with Aphelios. Obviously, there's probably going to be some more support cards revealed, and at that point, there could be like new different kinds of decks we can make. I'm pretty hyped for it. I've mentioned in this video, I really love Aphelios' design. This is, I think, one of my favorite champion designs that I've seen so far. It's really hard to say. It's a real enigma to evaluate this card. But I'll leave you guys in this video with a couple of additional tips as well. I didn't want to build full decks for every concept that I thought of with Aphelios, but there's some of them that are really kind of funny to think about, even though they're probably not going to lead to decks that are kind of even remotely competitive, like full meme stuff. So, for example, you can run Aphelios with Starlit Seer, a full Freljord deck that's, Freljord Targon running mostly spells, pretty much all spells, and you just you pull out a Starlit Seer, you can tutor it with the new card Crescendum, and then you just spam a bunch of spells. Starlit Seer triggers a bunch of buffs. You play another Crescendum, it pulls out another Starlit Seer that's also really buffed, and you can give it like Overwhelm sometimes and win the game off of it. Ultimately, it's like a really, really bad ballistic bot, but it's a pretty adorable strategy. Freljord just doesn't offer quite enough to that. And if I were to build that deck, it would just be kind of like, it would be kind of a worse version of the PNZ one, right? There's just not enough reason to be in Freljord, I believe. Another really adorable thing we can actually do with these weapons is, if we were so inclined, we could make a Yasuo deck. It would be a full meme deck, but Yasuo does hit the synergies in a couple of different ways. We have the ability to give Yasuo lifesteal. A bit of a tip with Yasuo that not a lot of people know is that when you deal damage with any ability in the game that's not a skill, lifesteal will actually apply to that damage as well. This has actually been used in some decks in the past. It's really cool. So like if you give Ezreal lifesteal, his deal 1 to Nexus will also lifesteal, right? Like it's actually a really cool concept, and it's like almost made sense in competitive decks. For Yasuo, what this means is if you give him lifesteal, this deal 2 will lifesteal, as well as if he's leveled up, his strikes will lifesteal, of course. So it's a cool way of sometimes just regenerating all of your HP in one turn when you're kind of like mid-game sweeping. And of course, we've got Gravitum, which is potentially a double stun trigger for Yasuo as well, which is pretty cool. The only problem with Yasuo is that, I mean, those two things are basically where the synergy starts and ends. Yasuo is obviously not a very competitive archetype, but even outside of that, the best way to play Yasuo is probably not changed. There's like, you can definitely build a Yasuo, you can definitely build a Yasuo deck with Aphelios, but it's not only going to be a meme deck, it's going to be a bad version of a meme deck. Because like, if you were to take a Yasuo Noxus deck and refine it, it actually wouldn't be that bad, but it's, yeah, I mean, it's just too many steps beyond what Yasuo really needed or wanted. Like, he doesn't really want to be in Targon, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so that's it. Those are my ideas for building Aphelios. It's going to be a lot of fun. Looking forward to when this launches in like literally over a month from now. All right, guys, that was my theory crafted Aphelios decks. I hope you guys enjoyed, and you know, let me know if you guys have some other ideas. Like I love doing this theory crafting just because it's so fun to talk about different ways of being able to use it. Like Aphelios is a really interesting card that I think a lot of people have different conceptions of how it's kind of best to build him. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of angles to this card that I haven't really covered in this video. So if you guys have any bright ideas, I'm all ears, because I'm going to be building more Aphelios decks even like before it comes out as well. All right, guys, that's it for me. I'll see you guys tomorrow.